Hello, my name is Priya, and I will be arguing against the resolution stating that the United States federal government ought to pay reparations to African Americans. My opponent states that the moral basis for giving reparations stems from the legacy and history of oppression towards African Americans and that these reparations must come in the form of monetary investments towards educational programs and economic opportunities. I would like to respond to this argument as follows, first with on-case arguments on the affirmative and next with several off-case arguments. First, I would like to offer a critique on the conception of African American identity. Second, a critique on America as a settler colonial nation state and how this is effectively facilitated for the genocide of Native Americans. And lastly, I would like to propose a counterplan in which the United States pays reparations in the form of foreign aid to African countries which have been destabilized by the legacy of colonialism. My opponent identifies the cycle of poverty as his primary contention for giving reparations. However, I would like to point out that the cycle of poverty is not a unique situation to just African Americans. According to the Congressional Research Service, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and whites also comprise a large percentage of the population living in poverty and have a combined aggregate that is higher than the percentage of blacks living in poverty. Next, my opponent argues that the reparations will expand economic opportunity for African Americans. I disagree. I believe that reparations will create a further divide and dependency within the African American community. According to activist Yusuf Nuruddin, reparations will create a class divide within the African American community because only a certain subset of African Americans, the black bourgeoisie, will have access to these opportunities and exploit it so that to create a larger class divide. My opponent provides a very limited understanding on the conception of African Americans, nor are they specific about who receives these reparations. They seem to create rigid categories as to what an African American constitutes. Additionally, this excludes other forms of identity such as black identity, Afro-Caribbean identity, and black African identity. This is problematic because in order to verify a person's identity as African American, we would have to resort to genetic testing, which would be inefficient, thus delaying and minimizing the impact of reparations as they would only go to a select few people. Additionally, focusing just on African Americans is problematic because historically the United States federal government has marginalized all communities of color by exploiting their labor. This is not just unique to African Americans. Throughout the history of our nation, the United States federal government has built its infrastructure and rose to power on the exploited labor of communities of color and migrant workers such as Chinese Americans, Irish Americans, Italian Americans, Latinos and Latinas, and many others. Focusing on just rigid African Americans while excluding oppression of others is wrong because it invisibilizes other forms of oppression. Secondly, and most importantly, America is a settler colonial nation state. African Americans have been used as instruments of colonization to help colonize the Americas, as have many other migrant workers. African Americans aided in America taking the land and robbing the resources of Native Americans that America capitalized off of. Slavery, enabled by the hyper-colonialist policies of the United States federal government, were responsible for the erasure of indigenous populations, and for the deplorable conditions of poverty and violence that they live in today. Focusing on African American reparations continues to invisibilize and perpetuate other forms of violence against indigenous populations. Instead, I propose a counterplan calling for an investment and expansion of foreign aid in African countries who have been adversely affected by the legacy of colonialism. Africa's infrastructure and current underdeveloped state can be best attributed to the effects of colonialism and the enslavement of its citizens. The massive forced migration of millions of Africans through the triangle slave trade caused an unprecedented drain of brain power and shrunk the labor force. The brain drain and reduced labor force then made Africa more vulnerable to the overall effects of colonialism, such as the exploitation of natural resources, violation of human rights, and overall destabilization of the region. Investing in Africa can therefore be justified because it can help transform their economies and build their infrastructure. In turn, African nations can play a more active role in the global economy. Building their infrastructure and economy will leave a resounding impact because it can be used to reach Millennium Development Goals and allow African nations to become competitive players in the global economy.